Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snow fell steadily outside, blanketing the countryside in an eerie silence. The Frostwood Inn sat alone at the edge of the forest, its old stone walls and creaking timbers defying the passage of time. It was Christmas Day, but there were no festive decorations adorning the inn, no laughter or music to warm the atmosphere. The few guests who had braved the winter storm were confined to their rooms, leaving the common area dark and empty. Margaret Reed had inherited the inn from her father years ago and had always done her best to keep it running. But this year felt different. The storm had cut off power, isolating them even further, and a deep unease had settled over the place. The staff spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the shadows, and Margaret herself had heard strange noises in the night, footsteps where no one should be, faint whispers in empty hallways. By early evening, only one guest lingered in the common room, Thomas Hale, a journalist from London who claimed he was writing a book on haunted locations. He sat by the fireplace, a notebook in hand, his glasses reflecting the dim glow of the dying fire. Margaret watched him from behind the reception desk, unsure whether to find his presence comforting or unsettling. "You don't believe the stories, do you?" Thomas asked, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, almost casual, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity. Margaret hesitated. "I've lived here all my life. My father never spoke of ghosts." Thomas leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the notebook. "And yet, the Frostwood Inn has quite the reputation. They say the forest behind the inn is cursed. People disappear. Strange lights are seen at night." It's just old folklore," Margaret replied, though her voice wavered slightly. "Stories to keep children from wandering too far." Thomas smiled faintly. "Perhaps, but every story has a kernel of truth, doesn't it?" Before Margaret could respond, the front door burst open, letting in a blast of icy wind and snow. A man stumbled in, his face pale and his clothes soaked through. He looked as though he had been running for miles. "Help me," he gasped, collapsing onto the floor. Margaret rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "What happened? Are you hurt?" The man shook his head, his eyes wide with terror. "They're out there, in the woods." Thomas set his notebook aside and approached. "Who's out there?" The man's voice dropped to a whisper. "The lights. They followed me." Margaret exchanged a glance with Thomas, her heart pounding. "You need to rest," she said, guiding the man to a chair near the fire. "You're safe here." But the man shook his head vehemently. "Nowhere is safe. They'll come for me. For all of us." As Margaret fetched a blanket and a cup of tea, Thomas turned to the man. "What did you see in the woods?" "Lights," the man repeated, his voice trembling. "They move like they're alive, and shadows. Figures in the dark. I don't know what they are, but they're not human." Margaret tried to dismiss his words as the ramblings of someone overwhelmed by fear, but her own unease grew. The inn had always been a sanctuary against the harsh winters and wild stories of the forest, but tonight it felt fragile, as though the walls couldn't keep out what lurked in the darkness. As night deepened, the wind howled around the inn, rattling the windows. The man eventually dozed off by the fire, his face pale and drawn. Margaret and Thomas sat in uneasy silence, each lost in their thoughts. It was just after midnight when the first sound came, a faint tapping at the window. Margaret froze, her gaze snapping to the frosted glass. There was nothing there, just the reflection of the dying firelight. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Thomas nodded, his expression tense. "Stay here." He grabbed a flashlight from his bag and moved toward the window. The tapping came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural moan. Thomas pulled back the curtain, shining the flashlight into the snow-covered yard. The beam revealed nothing but swirling snow and the dark line of trees beyond. "Probably a branch," Thomas said, though his voice lacked conviction. The tapping stopped, but the unease remained. Margaret glanced at the man by the fire, who stirred restlessly in his sleep, muttering incoherently. She could just make out a single word: run. A sudden bang echoed through the inn, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a panicked glance. "Everyone else is in their rooms," Margaret said, her voice barely audible. Thomas tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." "No," Margaret said firmly. "We'll go together." They climbed the creaking staircase, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. The footsteps continued, leading them toward the end of the hallway. Margaret's heart pounded as they approached the last door, a storage closet that hadn't been used in years. Thomas reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment before pushing it open. The flashlight revealed rows of dusty shelves and cobweb-covered boxes. The room was empty. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered. "I heard footsteps." "So did I," Thomas said, his voice tense. He swept the flashlight around the room, but there was no sign of anyone, or anything. As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. Margaret screamed, fumbling for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "Thomas!" she cried. "What's happening?" The flashlight flickered, and in its brief flashes of light, Margaret saw them, shadows moving along the walls, their forms distorted and unnatural. They didn't walk, but seemed to glide, their eyeless faces turned toward her. A cold hand brushed against her arm, and she screamed again. Thomas slammed his shoulder against the door, and it finally gave way. They stumbled out into the hallway, slamming the door behind them. "We need to get everyone out of here," Margaret said, her voice shaking. Thomas nodded. "Wake the guests. I'll get the man by the fire." But when they returned to the common room, the man was gone. The front door stood ajar, snow blowing in across the floor. "Where did he go?" Margaret asked, panic rising in her chest. Thomas pointed to the footprints leading out into the snow. "He went back into the woods." "Why would he do that?" Margaret whispered. Thomas didn't answer. He grabbed his coat and flashlight. "I'll go after him." "No," Margaret said, grabbing his arm. "You can't. Whatever's out there..." "He won't survive on his own," Thomas interrupted. "I'll be quick." Before she could stop him, Thomas stepped into the storm, the door slamming shut behind him. Margaret stood frozen, torn between following him and staying to warn the other guests. Her decision was made for her when the lights flickered, plunging the inn into darkness. A low, mournful wail echoed through the building, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Margaret grabbed a lantern from behind the desk, lighting it with trembling hands. She moved through the inn, knocking on doors and shouting for the guests to wake up. But each room she entered was empty. The beds were unmade, the belongings untouched, as though the guests had vanished without a trace. Despair gripped her as she returned to the common room. She was alone. The inn was silent, except for the howling wind and the faint, eerie tapping at the windows. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, time lost meaning as the storm raged on. Margaret sat by the fire, clutching the lantern and praying for dawn. She didn't hear the door open, but suddenly Thomas was there, his face pale and his clothes soaked with snow. "Did you find him?" Margaret asked, rising to her feet. Thomas shook his head, his expression hollow. "He's gone. They're all gone." "What do you mean?" Margaret whispered. Thomas didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to the window. Margaret turned, and her heart froze. The lights were there, soft, glowing orbs hovering just beyond the edge of the forest. They pulsed rhythmically, growing brighter and closer with each passing moment. "Close the curtains," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "We can't let them in." But Thomas didn't move. He stared at the lights, his expression blank, as though entranced. Margaret grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Thomas, don't look at them." He blinked, snapping out of the trance, and together they barricaded the windows and doors. The lights grew brighter, their glow seeping through every crack and crevice. Then came the whispers, faint at first, but growing louder, a chorus of voices speaking in a language Margaret couldn't understand. They filled her head, drowning out her thoughts until she could only scream. The lights burst into the room, flooding it with an unearthly brilliance. Margaret fell to her knees, covering her eyes as the voices reached a deafening crescendo. And then, silence. When Margaret opened her eyes, the room was empty. The lights were gone, and so was Thomas. The fire had burned out, leaving only ashes. Margaret stumbled outside, the storm finally abating. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the snow-covered landscape. The inn stood silent behind her, its windows dark and lifeless. She turned toward the forest, her breath visible in the cold morning air. For a moment, she thought she saw figures among the trees, shadows moving silently between the trunks. Margaret didn't wait to find out if they were real. She fled down the road, leaving the Frostwood Inn behind forever. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm swept over the countryside with unrelenting ferocity, transforming the landscape into a vast, icy expanse. Holly Granger tightened her coat as she trudged through the thick drifts, clutching a lantern in one hand and a basket of food in the other. She had agreed to house sit for her employer, Dr. Meredith Kane's sprawling and yet eerily isolated Victorian home. Dr. Kane had left town on urgent business, leaving Holly to look after the property and feed the elderly cat named Whiskers. It was Christmas Day, and Holly had planned to spend it quietly by the fire, sipping tea and reading. But the moment she stepped inside the house, she felt an oppressive weight settle over her, like unseen eyes were watching her every move. The house was cold despite the fire she lit in the hearth, and the wind outside howled as though something unnatural was carried on it. Whiskers mewed softly, weaving around her legs as if sensing her unease. Holly placed her basket on the kitchen counter and turned on the lights, which flickered ominously before stabilizing. She shook her head. "Just an old house," she muttered to herself, "nothing to be scared of." The storm worsened as night fell, and the power cut out entirely. Holly lit candles and placed them around the house, their dim glow casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. She wrapped herself in a blanket and settled into the armchair near the fire, determined to pass the night with a book. But the silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards and the rattling of the windows. Around midnight, Holly heard it, a faint knock at the front door. Her heart froze. Who would be out in this weather? She set her book aside and approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No response. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural moan. Holly hesitated before opening the door a crack, the icy wind biting her skin. There was no one there, just the swirling snow and the dark silhouette of the forest beyond. She closed the door quickly, bolting it shut. Probably just the wind, she told herself, though her hands were shaking. As she turned back toward the living room, she noticed something odd. The front hallway, which had been dry when she arrived, now had a trail of wet footprints leading from the door to the staircase. They were barefoot and far too large to be hers. "Is someone here?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Whiskers hissed from the foot of the stairs, her fur bristling. Holly grabbed the lantern and followed the footprints, each step heavier than the last. The trail led up to the second floor, stopping in front of a closed bedroom door. She reached out to push it open, but the door creaked ajar on its own. Inside, the air was freezing, and the window was wide open despite the storm. Snow had blown in, covering the floor in a thin layer of frost. But what made her blood run cold was the figure standing by the window, a man, or what she thought was a man. He was tall and gaunt, his back turned to her, his tattered clothing flapping in the icy wind. "Who are you?" Holly managed to choke out. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he turned his head slowly, revealing hollow, sunken eyes and a face that seemed to shift and blur like smoke caught in a draft. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Holly stumbled backward, dropping the lantern. It shattered on the floor, plunging the room into darkness. The figure lunged toward her and she screamed, slamming the door shut and fleeing down the stairs. The house seemed alive now, the walls groaning and the wind howling louder than ever. Holly grabbed her coat and headed for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The locks were stuck as though frozen solid. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the door. But her voice was swallowed by the cacophony around her. The lights flickered back on, and she turned to see the man standing at the base of the stairs, his shadow stretching unnaturally long across the floor. His hollow eyes locked onto hers, and he raised a hand, pointing toward her. "Leave," he rasped, his voice like the wind through dead trees. "Leave before it's too late." "I'm trying," Holly cried, tears streaming down her face. "I can't get out." The figure vanished, and the house fell silent. Holly stood frozen, her breath visible in the icy air. Then she heard it, a faint melody, soft and haunting, coming from the parlor. She followed the sound, her feet moving as though compelled by an unseen force. On the mantelpiece sat a small music box, its lid open and its gears turning slowly. Holly didn't remember seeing it there before. The melody grew louder as she approached, and the room grew colder. Shadows danced on the walls, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for her. She tried to back away, but her feet wouldn't move. The man appeared again, this time standing directly in front of her. He raised a hand and placed it on the music box, silencing the tune. "You must destroy it," he said, his voice filled with anguish. "It binds them here. It binds me." "Who are you?" Holly whispered. "I was the last," he said, his form flickering like a dying flame. "The last to fall under its spell. If you don't destroy it, you will be next." Before Holly could respond, the shadows surged toward her, their icy touch stealing the breath from her lungs. She grabbed the music box and hurled it into the fire. The flames roared la, consuming the box in seconds. The shadows recoiled, their anguished cries filling the room as they dissolved into nothingness. The man gave Holly one last grateful look before fading away. The house fell silent once more, the oppressive weight lifting as the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Holly stood there, trembling, until the first rays of dawn broke through the frosted windows. When Dr. Kane returned a week later, she found the house empty, save for Whiskers, who sat calmly by the fire. Holly was never seen again, though locals claimed they could hear faint music coming from the forest on cold, quiet nights, a haunting reminder of the spirits that once lingered in the house. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snow fell relentlessly over the small mountain village of Black Hollow, blanketing the rooftops and winding roads in a thick layer of white. It was Christmas Day, and the townsfolk had retreated into their homes to celebrate by the warmth of their fires. All except for Evelyn Carter, who was still an outsider in the tight-knit community even after living there for 6 years. Evelyn had moved to Black Hollow for a fresh start after her divorce, purchasing an old cottage at the edge of the woods. The villagers whispered about her decision to live in Miller's Cottage, an abandoned home said to be cursed. They told her about James Miller, a reclusive man who had lived there decades ago and vanished without a trace on Christmas night. The legend varied depending on who told it. Some claimed Miller had gone mad, others said he had been taken by something in the woods. Evelyn dismissed the stories as small-town superstition. The cottage itself was charming, with a stone fireplace, weathered wooden beams, and a view of the sprawling forest behind it. But on this Christmas night, Evelyn couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept over her since the sunset. The storm outside was fierce, the wind howling through the trees and rattling the old windows. She had planned to spend the evening with a bottle of wine and a classic film, but the power had gone out hours ago, plunging the house into darkness. Sitting by the fire with only a lantern for light, Evelyn heard the first sound, a faint knock at the front door. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. No one ever visited her, especially not on a night like this. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Help me," it whispered, barely audible over the storm. Evelyn stood, gripping the lantern tightly. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. No one was there. The snow on the porch was untouched, yet the knocking persisted, steady and insistent. "Who's there?" Evelyn called, her voice trembling. No answer, just the relentless knocking. Summoning her courage, she unlocked the door and opened it a crack. The wind howled past her, but the porch was empty. She stepped outside, the cold biting at her skin, and scanned the yard. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. She closed the door quickly, bolting it shut. "Just the wind," she muttered to herself, though she didn't believe it. She returned to the living room, but the fire had burned low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The room felt colder now, as though the storm had seeped inside. As she added another log to the fire, she heard it again, a knock, but this time from the back door. Evelyn's stomach tightened. The back door led to the woods, and no one would approach from that direction. The knock came again, louder and more insistent. Taking the fire poker as a weapon, she made her way to the kitchen. The lantern light cast strange shapes on the walls, and the air felt thick, heavy. When she reached the back door, she paused, listening. "Help me," the voice whispered again, closer this time. It was low and strained, as if spoken through gritted teeth. Evelyn's hand hovered over the doorknob, her breath visible in the frigid air. She opened the door a crack, and the storm lashed against her face. The forest loomed beyond the yard, dark and uninviting. A figure stood just beyond the porch, barely visible in the swirling snow. "Please," it said, the voice cracked and desperate. "I'm lost." "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It stepped closer, but the snow obscured its features. Something about its movements was wrong, jerky, unnatural. Evelyn's instincts screamed at her to shut the door, and she did, bolting it tight. The knocking stopped, but the uneasy silence that followed was worse. She retreated to the living room, her grip on the fire poker tightening. The wind outside roared louder, shaking the walls. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the roof. Evelyn's breath hitched. She stared up at the ceiling, her heart pounding. The footsteps stopped directly above her, and for a moment there was only silence. Then the whispering began. "Evelyn," it said, her name drawn out in a chilling, sing-song tone. "Let me in." She clamped her hands over her ears, backing away from the fireplace. The shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and stretch, taking on sinister shapes. The temperature dropped further, her breath fogging the air. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices that filled the room. Evelyn screamed, "Leave me alone!" But her voice was swallowed by the cacophony. The fire went out with a violent hiss, plunging the room into darkness. The lantern flickered, and in its dim light, Evelyn saw them, figures standing in the corners of the room, their faces obscured, their forms flickering like static on a television screen. She stumbled backward, tripping over the coffee table. The figures didn't move, but their presence pressed down on her, suffocating. One of them raised a hand, pointing toward her. "Get out," it said, its voice guttural and echoing. Evelyn scrambled to her feet and bolted for the door. She didn't stop to grab her coat or shoes, didn't care about the storm raging outside. She just ran, the snow stinging her skin as she fled into the woods. The storm swallowed her, the wind howling like a living thing. She ran blindly, the lantern's light flickering in the darkness. Behind her, she heard footsteps crunching in the snow, but when she turned, no one was there. "Please," she gasped, her breath hitching. "Someone help me." The woods seemed endless, the trees closing in around her. She tripped over a root and fell, the lantern slipping from her grasp and shattering. Darkness engulfed her, and the whispers returned, closer this time. She crawled through the snow, tears streaming down her face. The whispers grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. She looked up and saw them again, figures standing among the trees, their eyeless faces turned toward her. Evelyn screamed, but the sound was lost in the storm. The figures moved closer, their forms blurring and shifting like smoke. She closed her eyes, praying for it to end. When she opened them again, the storm had stopped. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered ground. Evelyn was alone, the woods silent except for the faint rustle of the wind. She stumbled back to the cottage, her body trembling with cold and fear. The house stood dark and empty, the doors wide open, snow drifting across the threshold. She stepped inside, her bare feet numb against the icy floor. The living room was just as she had left it, the fire dead and the shadows still lingering in the corners. But something was different. On the mantelpiece sat a photograph she had never seen before, a faded image of a man standing in front of the cottage, his face eerily similar to the figure she had seen in the snow. Written on the back of the photograph were the words, "James Miller, Christmas 1932. Evelyn left Black Hollow that same day, never looking back. The cottage remained abandoned, its windows dark and uninviting. Locals claimed that on Christmas nights, if you stood near the edge of the woods, you could hear the wind whispering a name. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The Christmas snowfall began early in the morning, blanketing the town of West Ridge in a picturesque stillness. Streets lay silent, homes glowed with festive lights, and laughter echoed faintly from within cozy living rooms. But up on Briar Hill, in a dilapidated mansion that had been abandoned for decades, the silence was of a different kind. It was the kind that pressed against your chest and made your skin crawl. Lila Reynolds had no intention of spending Christmas Day in such a place, but when her cousin Tom dared her to stay in the old Blackwood Manor for a single night, she couldn't refuse. After all, she was 24, no longer a kid, and she didn't believe in ghost stories, least of all the ones about the Blackwood family. According to local legend, the Blackwoods were a wealthy family who lived in the mansion in the 1920s. On Christmas Eve, they hosted a lavish party. By Christmas morning, every guest, along with the Blackwoods themselves, had vanished without a trace. The only clue left behind was a single phrase scrawled on the dining room wall in red paint. "We are claimed." For decades, the mansion had stood as a crumbling monument to the mystery, and no one in West Ridge dared go near it. Lila didn't buy the stories, but as she trudged through the snow with her flashlight and sleeping bag, the sight of the towering, shadowy house gave her pause. The front door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a grand foyer cloaked in dust and decay. The once luxurious chandelier hung by a thread, and the faded wallpaper peeled like old skin. A cold draft swept through the room, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something metallic. "Well," Lila muttered to herself, "Merry Christmas." She set up her sleeping bag in the parlor, the only room where the floorboards seemed stable enough to hold her weight. The fireplace was long dead, but she'd brought a lantern and some candles. As the evening wore on, she passed the time scrolling through her phone and snacking on cookies she'd brought along. It wasn't until nearly midnight that the strange things began. The first sound was faint, footsteps echoing from upstairs. Lila froze, her flashlight pointing toward the ceiling. She told herself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But as the footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase, her logic began to crumble. "Hello," she called, her voice shaky. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Lila stood, gripping the flashlight tightly. She stepped into the hallway, shining the beam toward the staircase. There was nothing there, just the gaping darkness. And then she heard it. A whisper, soft and distant, coming from the dining room. "Leave." The word was unmistakable, carried on a breath that sent shivers down her spine. Her first instinct was to run, but her pride wouldn't let her. Tom would never let her hear the end of it if she bailed before morning. She forced herself to move toward the dining room, her pulse pounding in her ears. The room was as grand as the rest of the house, with a long mahogany table and high-backed chairs that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. But what caught her attention was the faint glow at the far end of the room. A single candle burned on the table, though she hadn't lit it. As she approached, she noticed something else, a faint outline of figures seated around the table. They were barely visible, like smudges on a fogged mirror, but their presence was undeniable. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The candle flickered and the room grew colder. One of the figures turned its head toward her, its face obscured but its hollow eyes boring into hers. "Leave," it said again, its voice overlapping with others, as though the entire room was speaking in unison. Lila stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house itself was mocking her. She fled back to the parlor, slamming the door shut and locking it behind her. She sat in the corner, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers followed her, faint but relentless, weaving through the cracks in the door. "We are claimed. We are claimed." The words repeated over and over, growing louder with each passing minute, and then, suddenly, they stopped. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant sound of the clock in the foyer chiming midnight. Lila's relief was short-lived. The door to the parlor creaked open, the lock snapping as though it had been forced. She shone her flashlight toward the doorway and saw them. The figures from the dining room, now fully visible. They were pale and translucent, their eyes black voids, their mouths twisted in unnatural smiles. One stepped forward, a woman in a tattered evening gown. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her voice dripping with sorrow. "Now it's too late." Lila screamed and ran for the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her like an unseen force. She turned to see the figures closing in, their hands reaching out as though to drag her into their shadowy depths. In her desperation, she remembered the legend, the phrase scrawled on the wall, "We are claimed." She glanced toward the dining room, and there it was, faint but still legible on the peeling wallpaper. "What do you want from me?" she cried. The woman in the gown tilted her head, her expression almost pitying. "You've entered our home on Christmas, and now you belong to it." The shadows surged forward, enveloping her in cold darkness. Lila's screams echoed through the house, blending with the mournful whispers of the spirits. When morning came, Tom arrived at Blackwood Manor, expecting to find Lila triumphant or annoyed. Instead, he found her flashlight lying in the snow by the porch, its battery drained. The front door creaked open when he pushed it, revealing an empty house. Lila was never found, but those who pass Blackwood Manor on Christmas night claim they've seen a new figure at the dining table, a young woman with wide, terrified eyes forever claimed by the curse of the house. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The town of Ravenswood was buried in snow on Christmas Day, its streets quiet under the soft glow of lampposts adorned with garlands and red bows. Though the townsfolk spent the day in warmth, exchanging gifts and laughter, there was one house on the outskirts that no one dared visit. Blackthorn House, an ancient estate surrounded by frost-bitten pines, had been abandoned for decades. Its grim silhouette was visible from anywhere in town, perched like a sentinel on the hill, a dark scar against the pristine landscape. Blackthorn's history was as cold and unwelcoming as its decaying walls. In 1892, the wealthy Linwood family had moved into the house, only for tragedy to follow. On Christmas Eve that same year, every member of the household vanished. Servants, children, and parents, gone without a trace. The only clue left behind was a single room in the attic where candles had been burned to stubs, their wax melted into shapes resembling strange symbols. From then on, the townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the curse of Blackthorn House. For Clara Bennett, the stories were little more than exaggerated folklore, crafted to keep children out of dangerous places. Clara was a journalist, new to Ravenswood and looking for a compelling piece to make her mark. What better story than uncovering the truth behind the Linwood disappearance? She didn't believe in curses or ghosts, only in forgotten truths waiting to be uncovered. That was why she found herself trudging up the hill through knee-deep snow late on Christmas afternoon. Her only company was her camera, a flashlight, and a notebook tucked into her coat pocket. The wind howled through the trees, and despite her heavy boots, the icy ground was slick beneath her feet. By the time she reached the wrought iron gates of Blackthorn House, her breath fogged in the freezing air and her legs ached from the climb. The house was more imposing up close, its once grand facade now a crumbling shell. Windows were broken, their glass glinting like jagged teeth. The front door hung slightly ajar, inviting yet menacing. Clara hesitated, her journalist instincts warring with a deep unease that churned in her gut. Shaking off the feeling, she pushed through the door. The interior was just as lifeless as the exterior. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight beam swept across the grand foyer, revealing a staircase with a broken banister and walls stripped bare of their once lavish wallpaper. Cobwebs draped the chandelier above her like shrouds. Clara's boots echoed loudly as she crossed the floor, each step stirring up a fine mist of dust. She whispered into her recorder, documenting her surroundings. December 25th. The interior shows signs of long-term neglect, but no evidence of structural collapse. The stories of the Linwood family's disappearance remain unverified, but her voice trailed off. A sound interrupted her, a soft, distant creak like footsteps on an upper floor. Clara froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She quickly rationalized it. Old houses were noisy. Wood shifted and groaned in the cold. Still, the sound had been too deliberate, too human. Ignoring the spike of fear crawling up her spine, she ventured deeper into the house. She entered what must have been the dining room, her light catching the remnants of a long table surrounded by mismatched chairs. A large mirror hung crooked on the far wall, its surface tarnished. Clara moved closer, intending to inspect the frame, when something caught her eye. In the reflection, a figure stood just behind her, a woman in a black dress, her face obscured by a veil. Clara spun around, her flashlight slicing through empty air. The room was vacant. Her breath quickened and she turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. "This is just your mind playing tricks," she muttered under her breath, though her hands were shaking. She forced herself to continue. She had come to uncover a story, not to be scared off by shadows and superstition. The sound of footsteps returned, this time accompanied by a faint whisper. Clara couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and urgent. She followed the noise, climbing the creaking staircase. Each step felt like it could give way beneath her weight, but she pressed on, her flashlight illuminating the path ahead. At the top of the stairs, a long hallway stretched into darkness, lined with doors that gaped open like mouths. The whispering grew louder, drawing her toward the far end where a single door remained closed. It looked newer than the others, as though it had been replaced recently, an odd detail in a house left untouched for decades. Clara hesitated before reaching for the handle. Her flashlight flickered, and she cursed under her breath. She banged it against her palm until the light steadied, but the interruption had unsettled her further. The whispers stopped as her fingers grazed the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, she turned it and pushed the door open. The attic. The room was eerily pristine compared to the rest of the house. The wooden floorboards were free of dust, and the air lacked the stale quality that permeated the lower floors. Candles lined the walls, their wax melted into strange, spindly shapes that resembled symbols or letters. In the center of the room was a circle etched into the floor, filled with intricate patterns that Clara didn't recognize. Her flashlight beam wavered as she stepped closer to inspect the markings. They looked freshly carved, the wood splintered at the edges. She crouched, running her fingers over the grooves, and her unease deepened. These weren't the remnants of a long-lost ritual. Someone had been here recently. A sudden gust of icy wind swept through the attic, extinguishing her flashlight and leaving her in pitch blackness. Clara fumbled for her phone, its feeble light barely illuminating her surroundings. The whispering returned, louder now surrounding her. It was no longer just one voice, but many, overlapping in a chaotic murmur that made her ears throb. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling. The whispering stopped, replaced by a single voice, low and rasping. "You shouldn't have come." Clara spun around, but the room appeared empty. Her phone's light fell on the mirror leaning against the far wall, and her stomach dropped. The reflection showed the room not as it was, but as it must have been on that fateful night in 1892. The candles were lit, casting flickering light over the walls. The circle on the floor glowed faintly, and figures stood around it, shadowy, indistinct shapes that swayed as though caught in a slow, hypnotic dance. In the center of the circle knelt a man, his face contorted in agony. His lips moved, but no sound came from him. Clara stepped closer, unable to tear her eyes away. The figures around him raised their hands, and the man screamed, a soundless, soul-wrenching cry that echoed in her mind. The mirror shattered, the shards scattering across the floor. Clara stumbled back, her phone clattering to the ground. The attic was dark again, but she wasn't alone. She could feel them. Cold, unseen hands brushing against her arms, her shoulders. The air around her grew heavy, pressing down on her chest. "You shouldn't have come," the voice repeated, now right beside her ear. Clara bolted, her heart hammering. She fled down the stairs, her feet slipping on the icy wood. The whispers followed her, growing louder, angrier. She reached the front door, yanking it open, and stumbled into the snow. She didn't stop running until she reached the bottom of the hill, her lungs burning and her vision blurred by tears. When she turned back, the house stood silent and dark, but the attic window glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. Clara didn't wait to see more. She fled back to town, her thoughts a jumbled mess of fear and disbelief. She never wrote the story. The experience haunted her for years, and though she tried to rationalize it, some part of her knew the truth. The Linwoods hadn't vanished. They had been claimed by something far older and darker than she could comprehend. And now, she feared, so had she. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The chill of Christmas morning had settled over the town of Milford. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, coating the streets and rooftops in a thick layer of white. Christmas lights twinkled along the rows of houses, and carolers sang their cheerful tunes as the town bustled with festive preparations. But at the edge of Milford, hidden by the dense trees of the forest, stood a house that had long been forgotten, a house that no one dared to speak of, even on Christmas Day. The Marlowe house had been abandoned for nearly 20 years. At least, that was what everyone assumed. The last time anyone had seen the Marlowe family, they were preparing to leave for a holiday trip. That was the year it all changed. A week later, the house was discovered empty. No one knew where the Marlowes had gone, and their disappearance remained one of the town's most enduring mysteries. Despite the mystery, the house was rarely mentioned anymore. The town had moved on, but the strange, lingering aura of the place remained, like a shadow cast over the quiet town. It was only on rare occasions that someone ventured near the old house, and it was usually a child, looking for a thrill or a dare. Adults steered clear. No one in Milford spoke of the Marlowes anymore, especially not at Christmas, when people were supposed to be celebrating, not reminiscing about the chilling events of the past. Lena Price, a young woman who had recently moved to Milford, had no idea about the history of the Marlowe house. She was an outsider, new to the area and unfamiliar with its local legends. A journalist at heart, she had been in town for only a few months, but she was determined to get the inside scoop on everything. And the Marlowe house, with its eerie reputation, was something she couldn't resist. On Christmas morning, after a quiet breakfast in her small apartment, Lena decided to go for a walk. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the town sparkling under the pale winter sun. She wandered through the streets, her boots crunching softly against the snow. As she passed by the edge of the town, she spotted the old house at the end of a long, winding lane. It loomed in the distance, its tall, dark silhouette a sharp contrast to the white blanket of snow around it. Her curiosity piqued. Lena made her way down the lane. The trees on either side of her stood tall and barren, their branches heavy with snow. The house grew larger with each step, and she began to feel a strange unease, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She had always been drawn to abandoned places, but there was something unsettling about this house. Still, her reporter instincts took over. This was a story waiting to be uncovered. The Marlowe house looked like something out of a forgotten fairy tale, the kind that children tell each other around campfires. The windows were dark, and the once proud front door sagged on its hinges. Ivy clung to the sides of the house, creeping up the stone foundation like a slow, creeping vine. Despite its dilapidated state, the house seemed to hold a strange kind of power, as if it had absorbed something over the years. Lena pushed open the gate and walked up the stone path toward the front door. Her breath puffed in small clouds before her, the only sound the crunch of her boots in the snow. When she reached the door, she hesitated, unsure if she should enter. But her desire to uncover the secrets of the house won out, and she carefully pushed the door open. Inside, the house was cold and silent. The air felt stale, as if it had been trapped here for years. Dust and cobwebs covered the floors, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, giving the entire house a ghostly appearance. Her flashlight flickered as she moved deeper into the house, its beam cutting through the darkness. As Lena explored the rooms, she found the remnants of what must have been a once beautiful home. Faded wallpaper clung to the walls, and the remnants of family photos were scattered on the floor. There were signs of a hasty departure. Half-packed suitcases, abandoned personal items, and even food left out on the kitchen counter, now long spoiled. Something about the house made her uneasy. The longer she stayed, the more she felt as though she was being watched. The house creaked and groaned, the floorboards shifting under her weight, but it wasn't just the noise that made her skin crawl. It was the feeling, the sensation that something was wrong. She couldn't explain it, but she knew. She wasn't alone. She heard a noise from upstairs, faint but unmistakable. A soft thud, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. Lena's heart skipped a beat. It was probably just an animal, a rat or something. But as she ascended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the house seemed to press in on her. The hallway at the top of the stairs was long and narrow, the doorways to the bedrooms closed. Lena's flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. She cursed under her breath and fumbled with the batteries. When the light finally turned back on, she saw something that made her freeze in place. At the end of the hallway, the door to one of the bedrooms was ajar, and she could see a faint light coming from within. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no way the light should be on. She had checked the house when she first entered. It had been dark, dead silent. The faint glow in the room grew brighter, as though someone had switched on a lamp. Her curiosity outweighed her fear, and she slowly walked toward the room. The door creaked open, and the light flickered again, revealing a small, cozy bedroom. But what she saw next made her blood run cold. The room wasn't empty. Sitting in the corner, just near the window, was a woman in a tattered red dress. Her hair was long and tangled, and her face was pale, almost lifeless. But it wasn't her appearance that terrified Lena. It was the fact that the woman wasn't moving. She was staring out of the window, her eyes empty and vacant. Lena's pulse raced. She wanted to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the woman. It was as though something held her there, as if the house itself had locked her in place. Suddenly, the woman's head snapped toward Lena, and her eyes met Lena's. They were not the eyes of a living person. They were hollow, black, and unblinking. The woman's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Lena's instincts took over. She turned and fled from the room, racing down the hallway toward the stairs. As she descended, the house seemed to come alive. The walls groaned, and the floorboards creaked under her feet, almost as though the house was chasing her. Her breath came in sharp gasps as she reached the bottom of the stairs, but when she turned to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her. She was locked in the house. The woman's voice echoed in her mind, her silent scream sending waves of terror through Lena's body. With nowhere else to go, Lena turned back toward the stairs. She had to get out. She had to leave. But as she ascended once more, the house seemed to close in on her. The walls shifted, and the floors groaned beneath her. She stumbled and fell into the darkness, hearing the whisper of footsteps behind her, footsteps that were not her own. And then, as if from nowhere, a soft melodic voice filled the air. Welcome home. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The snowstorm began earlier than expected, blanketing the countryside in an eerie stillness. The village church bell chimed 7 times, its sound muffled by the thick snowfall. In the fading light of Christmas Eve, a lone figure trudged through the snow toward Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling, decrepit mansion that had stood empty for decades. Mark and Sophia had inherited the estate from a distant relative neither had met, a reclusive uncle named Theodore Blackthorn. They had decided to spend Christmas there, despite its grim reputation. "It's just an old house," Mark had said confidently when the locals warned them of strange occurrences. "Ghost stories to keep kids in bed, nothing more." Sophia wasn't as sure. The house had an unsettling presence. Its tall, broken windows looked like hollow eyes staring out over the frozen landscape. Still, she had agreed to Mark's plan, thinking the adventure might be a welcome escape from the monotony of their usual holiday routine. The interior of Blackthorn Manor was as bleak as its exterior. Dust-covered furniture lined the vast, dimly lit rooms. An ornate chandelier hung precariously in the grand foyer, its crystals catching the faint glow of their lantern. Mark, ever pragmatic, set about lighting a fire in the massive stone hearth, while Sophia explored the house. The upper floor was colder than the rest of the house, the air thick with a faint musty scent. Sophia found herself drawn to a particular room at the end of a long hallway. Its door was slightly ajar, revealing a faint light flickering within. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a nursery. A rocking horse stood in one corner, its paint chipped and faded. A crib with delicate lace drapes sat against the far wall, and in the center of the room was a dollhouse, a perfect replica of Blackthorn Manor. Sophia knelt before the dollhouse, its intricate details captivating her, but as she reached out to touch it, the room grew colder. Her breath fogged in the icy air, and the faint sound of a child's laughter echoed behind her. Spinning around, Sophia saw no one. The nursery was empty, yet the laughter lingered, soft and haunting. She backed out of the room, her heart pounding, and hurried downstairs to find Mark. "I think I saw something," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Upstairs in the nursery." Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "Sophia, it's an old house, drafty and creaky. You're just letting the atmosphere get to you." But Sophia was insistent. "It wasn't just a feeling. I heard laughter, Mark. A child's laughter." Mark sighed, but he saw the fear in her eyes and relented. "Fine, let's check it out together." Armed with a lantern, they climbed the staircase and walked down the hallway to the nursery. When they entered, the room was exactly as Sophia had described, but eerily still. The dollhouse sat in the center, its tiny windows dark. "You probably just imagined it," Mark said, crouching to inspect the dollhouse. But as he reached out to open the miniature front door, a sudden gust of wind slammed the nursery door shut. Sophia screamed, clutching Mark's arm. "What was that?" Mark stood, his face pale. "Probably a draft," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. The air grew colder still, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside the nursery. They exchanged a glance, fear mirrored in their eyes, and moved cautiously toward the door. Mark opened it slowly, the hinges creaking loudly. The hallway was empty, but at the far end, a single candle burned on a small table that had not been there before. That wasn't here earlier, Sophia whispered, clutching Mark's arm tightly. Let's check it out, Mark said, his voice shaky. They approached the candle, the faint scent of wax and smoke filling the air. Beside it lay a photograph in a tarnished silver frame. It was an image of a man and a woman standing with a little girl. The man bore a striking resemblance to Mark. That's my great-uncle Theodore, Mark said, his voice barely audible. And that must be his wife and daughter. Sophia frowned. I thought he didn't have any children. He didn't, at least, not that anyone knew of. Before they could make sense of the photograph, the candle flickered violently, and the hallway was plunged into darkness. A soft, childlike voice echoed around them. Why did you leave me? Sophia gasped, clutching Mark tighter. Who's there? The voice came again, closer this time. I waited, but no one came. A sudden chill swept through them, and when the candle flared back to life, the little girl from the photograph stood before them. Her translucent figure shimmered in the dim light, her eyes wide and filled with sorrow. Help me, she whispered, reaching out to them. Sophia stepped forward despite her terror. What do you need? The girl's face crumpled in anguish. I want to go home. They left me here, alone. Tears filled Sophia's eyes. We'll help you. Tell us what to do. The girl pointed toward the nursery. The dollhouse. My room. Fix it. Mark and Sophia rushed back to the nursery, where the dollhouse now glowed faintly. Inside, the tiny furniture was overturned, the walls cracked and broken. Sophia began setting things right, her hands trembling as she arranged the miniature room. Mark repaired the cracked walls with glue he found in a desk drawer. As they worked, the nursery grew warmer, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. When they placed the final piece, a tiny rocking chair, back in its place, the glow from the dollhouse spread throughout the room. The little girl appeared once more, her expression one of peace. Thank you, she said softly. Then she faded, her figure dissolving into the light. Mark and Sophia stood in stunned silence, the weight of what they had experienced settling over them. When they returned to the hallway, the photograph and candle were gone, leaving no trace of the ghostly encounter. That Christmas morning, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow over Blackthorn Manor. For the first time in years, the house felt warm and alive, as though its long-held sorrow had finally been laid to rest. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The snow fell steadily outside the old Victorian house perched on the hill overlooking the small town of Milford. The Christmas lights strung along the eaves of the house flickered softly in the darkness, their glow illuminating the thick drifts of snow piling up on the porch. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the scents of pine, cinnamon, and baking cookies. The Beckett family had gathered for their annual Christmas celebration. This year, however, they had chosen to spend the holiday in the ancestral home, a place long abandoned and steeped in family history and rumor. Though the house was beautiful, with its ornate woodwork and high ceilings, it had a reputation. Stories of strange occurrences, whispered voices, and shadowy figures had surrounded the house for as long as anyone could remember. Ellie, the youngest of the Beckett clan at just 12 years old, sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the roaring fireplace, her wide eyes reflecting the flames. Grandpa, she asked hesitantly, is it true what they say about this house? That it's haunted? The room fell silent, the laughter and chatter of the family fading like a distant echo. Grandpa Henry, an elderly man with a lined face and twinkling eyes, chuckled softly, though his expression grew thoughtful. Haunted? That's a strong word, he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. But this house has its share of stories. Ellie leaned forward, her curiosity outweighing her apprehension. What kind of stories? Henry glanced at the other family members, who had grown quiet, their faces a mix of amusement and unease. Well, he began, there's one story in particular. A Christmas story of sorts. It happened right here in this house, over 100 years ago. The family shifted in their seats, the festive mood dimming as the room grew still. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes as if beckoning them to listen. Back then, Henry continued, his voice low and measured, this house belonged to my great-grandparents, Edward and Margaret Beckett. They were a wealthy couple, well-respected in town, and they threw grand Christmas parties every year. People from all over the county would come to celebrate. But the year I'm speaking of, something terrible happened. Ellie hugged her knees to her chest, her heart beating faster. What happened? It was Christmas Eve, Henry said, his gaze distant. The snow was falling just as it is tonight, and the house was filled with music and laughter. Among the guests was a young maid who worked for the Becketts. Her name was Clara. She was a quiet girl, timid but kind, and she had caught the eye of Edward's brother, Thomas. Henry paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Thomas was a charming man, but he had a dark side. He was known to be cruel when he didn't get his way. And that night, after too much wine and too many stolen glances, Thomas cornered Clara in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Ellie's breath hitched. What did he do? Henry's expression darkened. No one knows for certain, but Clara was never seen alive again. Some say she fell from the window trying to escape. Others believe Thomas pushed her in a fit of rage. Her body was found in the snow the next morning, broken and lifeless. The family exchanged uneasy glances, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the room. But that wasn't the end of it, Henry said, his voice dropping to a whisper. From that night on, strange things began happening in this house. Guests reported hearing a woman's cries echoing through the halls. Cold drafts swept through rooms with no windows opened, and some even claimed to see a figure in a white dress standing at the top of the grand staircase, staring down with the eyes. Ellie shivered, pulling the edges of her sweater tighter around her. Do you think Clara's ghost is still here? Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes glinting in the firelight. I don't know, child. But they say that on Christmas Eve, if you're very quiet, you can still hear her footsteps and her sobs. The family sat in uneasy silence, the story casting a pall over the festive atmosphere. But soon they shook off their discomfort, laughing nervously and turning their attention back to the fire, the music, and the food. That night, as the family retired to their respective rooms, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The old house creaked and groaned as the wind howled outside. But it was more than that. There was an oppressive stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Ellie's room was at the end of a long hallway, its door slightly ajar. She lay in bed, clutching a worn teddy bear, her eyes darting to the shadows dancing on the walls. As the clock struck midnight, she heard it, a soft, mournful wail that seemed to come from the hallway. Her heart pounded as she sat up, straining to hear. The sound came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the faint creak of footsteps on the wooden floorboards. Hello? Ellie called out, her voice trembling. Is someone there? The footsteps stopped abruptly. She waited, her breath hitching, but there was no reply. Gathering her courage, Ellie slipped out of bed and crept to the door. She peeked into the hallway, her fingers gripping the edge of the doorframe. The hallway was empty, the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. But at the far end, near the staircase, she saw it, a figure in a white dress, its face obscured by shadows. Clara? Ellie whispered, though she wasn't sure why. The figure didn't move. It stood motionless, its head tilted as if listening. Ellie took a hesitant step forward, her curiosity outweighing her fear. But as she did, the figure began to fade, dissolving into the darkness. Ellie gasped, stumbling back into her room. She slammed the door shut and crawled under the covers, her heart racing. She didn't sleep for the rest of the night, her mind replaying the ghostly apparition over and over. The next morning, as the family gathered for breakfast, Ellie hesitated to share what she had seen. But when Grandpa Henry asked how she'd slept, she couldn't hold it in. I saw her, Ellie blurted out. I saw Clara. The room fell silent, the clinking of silverware ceasing. Henry's eyes narrowed. Are you sure, child? Ellie nodded, her hands trembling. She was at the end of the hallway by the stairs. She just disappeared. Henry exchanged a look with the other adults, his expression grave. Well, he said finally, perhaps it's time we made peace with her. What do you mean? Ellie asked, her voice small. Sometimes, Henry said. Spirits linger because they have unfinished business. If Clara is still here, perhaps she needs our help to move on. The family agreed to hold a small ceremony that evening, lighting candles and saying prayers for Clara's spirit. They gathered by the grand staircase, their voices soft and reverent as they spoke words of peace and forgiveness. As the final candle was lit, a sudden chill swept through the room. The flames flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And then, just for a moment, a soft, sorrowful sigh echoed through the air. The family froze, their eyes wide. But as quickly as it had come, the chill subsided, leaving behind a sense of calm. Ellie swore she saw a faint smile in the darkness, a glimpse of gratitude before it faded into the night. From that day on, the Beckett house felt different. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by warmth and light. The ghost of Clara was never seen again, but her story lived on, a reminder of the past and a lesson in compassion. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The wind whipped across the frozen lake, carrying with it the distant sound of bells, a high, haunting chime that seemed to echo through the snow-covered forest surrounding Fairmont Lodge. The old hunting cabin, long abandoned and half buried in snow, was barely visible in the dim twilight of Christmas Eve. The Whitman family on a holiday retreat had stumbled upon the cabin while exploring the area earlier that day. The discovery had thrilled 12-year-old Danny and his older sister Claire, both adventurous by nature, though their parents had cautioned them to keep their distance. "It's not safe," their father Robert had warned. "The roof could cave in. No one's been in there for years." Still, Danny couldn't resist the pull of the mysterious lodge. That evening, after dinner and games by the fire, he slipped on his coat and boots, grabbed a flashlight, and sneaked out into the snowy night. The forest was eerily silent, save for the crunch of his boots on the snow. The flashlight beam wavered as he approached the lodge, its warped wooden walls casting jagged shadows. A single lantern still hung by the front door, rusted and crooked as if waiting for someone to return. Inside, the air was cold and damp, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. Danny's breath clouded before him as he swept the flashlight across the room. The lodge was filled with relics of a bygone era, broken furniture, hunting trophies, and a massive stone fireplace coated in soot. On the mantel above the fireplace was a framed photograph, its glass cracked. Danny picked it up, wiping away the dust to reveal an image of a smiling family, parents and 2 children, a boy and a girl. They stood in front of the very lodge he was standing in, their faces frozen in time. "Who were you?" Danny whispered to the photograph. A sudden creak behind him made him jump. He spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The room was empty. Just the old wood settling, he told himself, though his pulse quickened. He turned back to the photograph, only to find the glass fogged over as if someone had breathed on it. He wiped it again, but this time the smiling faces seemed distorted. The boy's grin had twisted into a grimace, his eyes wide with terror. Danny dropped the photograph, its glass shattering on the floor. He backed away, heart pounding when the sound of bells returned, louder and closer. The haunting chime seemed to come from the far end of the lodge, where a narrow staircase led to the upper floor. "Danny?" The voice startled him, and he whipped around to see Claire standing in the doorway, her own flashlight illuminating the room. "What are you doing out here?" she asked, her tone a mix of concern and irritation. I saw something," Danny stammered, pointing to the photograph. But when Claire approached, the glass was no longer broken, and the family's faces were as cheerful as ever. "You've been watching too many scary movies," Claire said, rolling her eyes. "Come on, let's go back." But Danny couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Wait," he said, glancing toward the staircase. "There's something upstairs." Claire hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but if you're messing with me, you're grounded for life." They climbed the creaking stairs together, their flashlights casting long shadows on the peeling wallpaper. At the top, they found a narrow hallway lined with doors. Most were ajar, revealing empty rooms filled with broken furniture and tattered curtains. But one door at the end of the hall was closed. As they approached, the sound of bells grew louder. Claire exchanged a nervous glance with Danny, but he stepped forward, his hand trembling as he turned the doorknob. The room was a child's bedroom, untouched by time. A toy train sat on the floor, its tracks circling a faded rug. A rocking chair swayed gently by the window, though no breeze stirred the air. And on the bed was a porcelain doll, its glass eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. "This is creepy," Claire whispered, her bravado fading. Danny nodded, stepping toward the rocking chair. As he reached out to still it, the bells stopped abruptly, replaced by a soft melodic humming. "Do you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice barely audible. Danny nodded again, his throat dry. The humming seemed to come from the doll, its lips motionless but its presence unnervingly alive. He bent down, his flashlight illuminating its delicate features. "Why are you here?" a voice whispered. Danny and Claire spun around, their flashlights shaking as they searched the room. No one was there, but the air grew colder, their breath visible in the icy chill. "We should go," Claire said, grabbing Danny's arm. But before they could leave, the doll's head had turned sharply to face them, its glass eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. The humming grew louder, distorted and menacing as the room began to tremble. The rocking chair toppled over, and the toy train began to move on its own, circling the rug at an impossible speed. "Run!" Claire screamed, pulling Danny toward the door. They bolted down the hallway, the sound of the humming and the train chasing them. The stairs groaned under their weight as they stumbled back into the main room, slamming the front door behind them. Outside, the bells chimed again, their haunting melody fading into the distance as the lodge fell silent. Danny and Claire stood in the snow, their breaths ragged. "What was that?" Claire demanded, her voice shaking. "I don't know," Danny said, clutching his flashlight. "But it didn't want us there." The lodge loomed behind them, dark and foreboding. As they turned to leave, Danny glanced back one last time. Through the cracked window, he saw the doll standing in the center of the room, its glass eyes watching them go. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of their family's cabin. That night, as the wind howled outside, they vowed never to speak of the lodge again. But every Christmas Eve, Danny swore he could hear the faint sound of bells drifting through the air, calling him back to the darkness of Fairmont Lodge. Story the end.
Story number 10.
Snow fell thick and silent on the small English village, blanketing rooftops, hedgerows, and cobblestone streets in a pristine layer of white. Families huddled in their homes, the warm glow of candlelight flickering against frosted windows. It was Christmas Day, a time for joy, laughter, and togetherness. Yet, in the old manor house on the edge of town, the atmosphere was anything but festive. Eleanor Kensington had inherited Blackwood Manor after her grandmother's passing the previous summer. Despite its crumbling facade and overgrown gardens, Eleanor had decided to host Christmas there, hoping to breathe life back into the estate. She invited her closest friends, promising roaring fires, a feast, and good company. The group arrived on Christmas Eve, their laughter echoing through the cavernous halls as they unpacked gifts and poured glasses of mulled wine. But as the evening wore on, an unsettling chill seeped into the manor, one that no amount of firewood could dispel. By Christmas morning, the mood had soured. A sense of unease hung in the air like an unwelcome guest. Eleanor tried to dismiss it as paranoia, blaming the creaking floorboards and drafty windows for her nerves. But by the time darkness fell, even the most skeptical among them could not ignore the strange occurrences. It began with the music box. Eleanor found it on the mantelpiece in the drawing room, a delicate antique with intricate carvings. She hadn't placed it there and was certain it hadn't been among her grandmother's belongings. When she wound it, the tune it played was hauntingly familiar, a soft, melancholy melody that sent shivers down her spine. Probably just an old relic left behind, her friend Mark suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. That night, as they gathered around the fire to exchange stories, Eleanor brought up the peculiar item. "Do you think it belonged to my grandmother?" she asked. Her friend Alice shook her head. "I don't remember seeing it last time I visited. Are you sure it wasn't hidden away somewhere?" Before Eleanor could respond, the flames in the fireplace flickered violently, as though an icy wind had blown through the room. The group fell silent, their breaths visible in the sudden chill. A loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to any of them. "Stay here," Mark said, grabbing a poker from the hearth. He hesitated before heading toward the staircase, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. Eleanor and the others exchanged nervous glances, the firelight casting long shadows across their faces. The music box's tune began to play faintly, though no one had touched it. Alice clutched Eleanor's arm. "Did you hear that?" Eleanor nodded, her throat dry. "It's coming from upstairs." Mark returned moments later, his face pale. "There's nothing up there," he said, his voice shaking, "but the attic door was open." "The attic?" Eleanor whispered. She hadn't set foot in the attic since she moved in, her grandmother's warning echoing in her mind. Never go up there, Ellie. Some things are best left undisturbed. What did you see? Alice asked. Mark shook his head. Just old furniture and trunks. But I swear I felt something, like someone was watching me. The group decided to sleep in the same room that night, dragging mattresses and blankets into the drawing room. The fire burned low as they huddled together, every creak and groan of the house amplifying their fear. Eleanor was the first to wake. The room was bathed in an unnatural light and the music box played softly in the background. She sat up, her heart pounding as she realized she wasn't alone. A figure stood near the window, its back turned to her. It was dressed in tattered clothing, its shoulders hunched as though weighed down by sorrow. "Who's there?" Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. The figure turned slowly, revealing a gaunt face with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through her. Its lips moved, but no sound came out. Eleanor scrambled backward, her scream waking the others. "What happened?" Mark demanded, grabbing her by the shoulders. Eleanor pointed to the window, but the figure was gone. The only evidence of its presence was a faint frost clinging to the glass in the shape of a handprint. "We need to leave," Alice said, her voice breaking. Something is wrong with this place. But when they tried to open the front door, it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed tight and their phones had no signal. It was as though the manor itself had become their prison. Desperate for answers, Eleanor decided to confront the attic. Armed with flashlights, the group ascended the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The attic door creaked open, revealing a room filled with dust and shadows. In the center of the attic was an old trunk, its lid slightly ajar. Eleanor hesitated before approaching it, her friends close behind. Inside, she found a bundle of letters, their edges yellowed with age. She unfolded the top one, her hands shaking as she read. "My dearest Eleanor, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and the curse has passed to you. Blackwood Manor is not a home but a tomb for the restless spirits trapped within its walls. They seek revenge for the sins of our ancestors. Beware the music box. It calls to them. Do not let them take you." The letter ended abruptly, the ink smeared as though the writer had been interrupted. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she realized the name signed at the bottom. Margaret Kensington. "My grandmother knew," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She knew this would happen. The group barely had time to react before the attic door slammed shut. The temperature plummeted and a deafening wail filled the room. Shadows materialized, their forms twisting and writhing as they closed in on the group. Eleanor clutched the music box, its melody growing louder. "What do you want?" she screamed. "Why won't you leave us alone?" A voice whispered in her ear, cold and venomous. "You cannot escape your bloodline." In a moment of clarity, Eleanor wound the music box and hurled it across the room. It shattered on impact, the melody cutting off abruptly. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissolving into mist. The attic door creaked open, and the oppressive chill lifted. The group stumbled out of the manor at dawn, their breaths visible in the crisp morning air. They didn't speak as they walked down the snow-covered path, leaving Blackwood Manor behind. Eleanor never returned. The estate fell into disrepair, a forgotten relic of a dark past. But on cold, silent nights, villagers claimed they could hear the faint melody of a music box drifting through the air, a haunting reminder of the ghosts that still lingered within its walls. Story: the end.